The light through the window had not changed in 11 days. That was the first thing Maren Solberg noticed when she woke. Not the hum of the environmental recyclers, not the smell of recycled air pressing flat against her face like a palm, but the quality of light from the porthole. The same pale, sourceless grey as it had been yesterday and the day before, and every morning since the Varath fleet had settled into geosynchronous orbit above the North Atlantic and simply waited. She sat up on the edge of the bunk and looked at the water. The harbor below was still navigable, technically. The Varath had not prohibited movement. They had prohibited communication. Signal above 200 megahertz, everything that could carry voice or data beyond the horizon. But boats could still move, small ones, and sometimes they did. She watched one now, a lobster tender running south along the channel, its wake spreading white and then, smoothing over like the water, was embarrassed it had ever been disturbed. Behind the tender, barely visible through the morning haze, one of the Varath observation buoys sat in the water like a dark comma. They had dropped 17 of them along the eastern seaboard. Nobody knew exactly what the buoys measured. That was the point, the analyst said. The uncertainty was a message. We are watching something you cannot name. Maren was 34 years old. She had a PhD in xenolinguistic pattern analysis from MIT, and she was, as of 11 days ago, the senior-most human specialist still operating inside the Varath exclusion zone. The rest of her team had been evacuated. She had asked to stay. There was a reason for that, and she had not explained it to anyone, because the reason was the kind of thing that sounds insane when you say it out loud. And she believed the buoys were listening to the boats. Not to their radios. Those were silent. They'd all gone silent the first day. To the boats themselves, the fiberglass, particular knock of a diesel engine at low RPM. The way a hull moved through water. She had written 3 pages of notes about it in the margin of a legal pad, and then torn the pages out and burned them in the steel basin she used for washing up. Because she was not ready to be wrong about this yet, she put on her boots and went downstairs. The building was a converted harbormaster's station, white clapboard, 2 floors, built sometime in the 1940s and renovated badly in the 1980s. The ground floor smelled like old wood and the particular sourness of rooms that have been closed too long. Devorian was already up, standing at the window with a mug of something that was not quite coffee, watching the harbor. "The big one moved," he said without turning around. She looked. The nearest Varath vessel. They called it the Chandelier for the way its lower structure hung in elongated clusters, had shifted perhaps 40 degrees overnight. It was still well above the cloud layer, a presence felt more than seen, but the angle of its shadow had changed. The shadow fell now across the northeastern reach of the harbor. Same time as yesterday, roughly. She poured herself water from a jug and drank it standing at the counter. Devorian Kelso was her assistant, 26, formerly a graduate student in applied acoustics. He was from Dubrovnik and he spoke 4 languages, and he had a habit of humming very quietly when he was thinking. A barely audible vibration that she had come to use as a kind of instrument. Right now he was humming. "You're humming," she said. "I know. What are you thinking?" He turned from the window. He had a face that was always on the edge of something, concern, amusement, some private calculation, and right now it was closer to concern than she'd seen it in days. "I think they responded to the Henderson boat," he said. She set down her water. The Henderson boat was a 40-foot wooden sloop owned by a man named Art Henderson, who had, 10 days ago, refused to move his vessel from its mooring despite 3 separate requests from the Emergency Coordination Office. He was 81 years old. He had kept that mooring for 53 years, and he had told the emergency coordinator to go explain himself to someone who cared. So the sloop sat there in its mooring, 160 meters off the dock, rising and falling with the tide the way it had risen and fallen every day for more than half a century. 3 days ago, the nearest Varath buoy had moved. It had moved slowly over the course of about 6 hours, repositioning itself until it was precisely equidistant between 2 fixed reference points, the Henderson sloop's mooring and an automated weather station on the breakwater. Marin had measured it herself with a laser rangefinder and then sat for a long time with the numbers and what they might mean. "Walk me through it," she said. Devorian set down his mug. He went to the table where they had laid out their instruments, a seismic listener, a low-frequency hydrophone, a pressure differential meter they'd rigged from salvaged components, and he opened his notebook. At 0340 this morning, the Henderson boat swung on its mooring, wind shifted, nothing unusual. Took about 12 minutes to settle into the new heading. He paused. The chandelier started its rotation at 0337. She heard what he was saying. Before the boat moved, 3 minutes before, she sat down. The chair was the wrong height for the table, something she'd never gotten used to, and she sat at an awkward angle and looked at the numbers in his notebook and thought about what they meant. The Verith had been in orbit for 11 days. In that time, they had issued exactly one communication, a 17-second transmission that had arrived on a frequency no human instrument had been designed to receive, and which the Emergency Global Response Team had spent a week translating into something that resembled meaning. The best interpretation, now widely accepted, a territorial acknowledgement. "We are here, we have noted your presence, we are in the process of assessment." Assessment of what? The response team had asked through every diplomatic channel they could construct in a week. Silence. No, not silence. The buoys, the shadow shifts of the chandelier. The way the observation craft at the outer perimeter had repositioned itself twice in 11 days, each time seemingly in response to something no one could identify. Marin had been the one to say, in a secure meeting she'd been patched into via a line they were still allowed to use, that the repositioning might be responses rather than initiatives, that the Verith might be answering something. The room on the other end of the line had gone quiet in a way she'd felt through the static. "What are they answering?" the general had asked. "I don't know yet," she'd said. "Give me more time." Now Devorian was watching her. He had the hydrophone readings from the past 3 days laid out in careful columns, and she could see the notations he'd made in the margins, the times of the chandelier rotations cross-referenced, arrowed to the times of events in the harbor. The sloop swinging on its mooring, a charter boat running its engine at idle for 20 minutes before dawn. A dinghy, oars only, crossing the inner harbor on the morning of the 4th day. She took the notebook from him and spread it on her knees and looked at the columns. It was not a response to the mechanical. She had thought at first it might be engine vibration, the Verith reacting to human technology, cataloging its signatures. But the dinghy had no engine, and the dinghy transit, a 10-minute crossing at maybe 2 knots, had been followed by the buoy cluster on the north side of the harbor, rotating in unison, a slow clockwise drift that had taken 6 hours, and that she had assumed at the time was drift, had recorded as drift, had almost discarded. She looked at the timestamps again. The dinghy had been moving at 0620. The buoys had begun their rotation at 06, 2 minutes, 3 minutes before the sloop. 2 minutes before the dinghy. They were anticipating. They were modeling. They had a model of the harbor's behavior that was accurate enough to run 2 to 3 minutes ahead of the actual event. She looked up at Devorian. He was watching her with that face. "How long have they been watching this harbor?" she asked. "The buoys have been here 11 days. Not these buoys," she said. "How long have they been watching this harbor?" He was quiet. She could see him working it through. The Verith had announced their presence 11 days ago. That was when their fleet had appeared in orbit, sudden and complete, no approached, detected by any telescope or tracking system, which was a thing that should not have been possible and which was now simply a fact they all lived with. But the appearance in orbit was not the same as the beginning of observation. A model accurate enough to predict small craft behavior 2 to 3 minutes out in a tidal harbor with variable wind conditions. You didn't build that in 11 days. You built that over months. Years from a distance, probably. Patient and methodical and utterly invisible. She thought about the light through the porthole, the same light every morning. She thought about the tide. "They've been here for a long time," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. Once, she stood up and went to the window and looked at the water. The lobster tender was gone now, just its wake still spreading. The Henderson sloop sat at its mooring, with the particular patience of old wooden things, the patience of objects that have outlasted several of the people who made them. The Verith buoy floated 200 meters north of it, a dark comma in grey water. She thought about what you do when you've been watched for years without knowing it, whether it changed anything. Whether the watching itself was a kind of message, the most patient message possible. We are the kind of thing that watches for a long time before it speaks. And she thought, but they did speak. 17 seconds, on a frequency we weren't designed to receive, on a day they chose. Not the first day they arrived, not immediately. They had been in orbit for 6 hours before the transmission. 6 hours of watching us react to their appearance. The scrambled jets, the emergency broadcasts, the shipping lanes, gone chaotic, with vessels trying to reach port or flee port depending on how frightened the captain was. And then after 6 hours of watching all of that, they had spoken. She went back to the table. She found the transcription of the 17-second transmission, the one that had been translated as territorial acknowledgement, and she read it again. The translation team had been working from mathematical first principles, primes, physical constants, the kind of universal language that theoretical xenolinguistics assumed any spacefaring civilization would share. Their translation was, "We are here, we have noted your presence, we are in the process of assessment," but they had been assuming the communication was about geography. Location and status, the hello of an entity announcing itself, and maybe that was right. But she thought about the harbor, about the boats. She thought about what it would mean if the transmission wasn't a statement but a question. She thought about what it would mean if "we are in the process of assessment" meant, "We have been watching you for a long time, and we are asking you now whether you have noticed us watching." "Devorian," she said, "the Henderson boat. Does Art Henderson go aboard in the mornings?" He thought about it. "I've seen him. Usually around 0800. Checks the bilge, I think. Just maintenance." She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 0743. She picked up her jacket. He watched her. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to ask Art Henderson if he'd be willing to take his boat out this morning." A pause. Why? She shrugged into the jacket. It was an honest question, and she wanted to give it an honest answer. "Because I think they've been watching this harbor for a long time," she said. "Long enough to build a model. Long enough to know the boats, and I think they reached out 11 days ago because they wanted to know if we'd noticed them watching." She paused. "The buoys aren't measuring us. They're waiting to see if we'll move toward them." He stared at her. "You want to sail toward a Verith buoy." "Slowly," she said, "at a normal pace. The way you'd sail toward something you'd always known was there." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him running through the same logic she had run through, checking it for the places where it broke down. It was possible, she knew, that this was simply the most elaborate possible form of wishful thinking. It was possible the buoys were surveillance, pure and simple, and that sailing toward one would produce no response whatsoever, or would produce a response she had not anticipated and would not enjoy. She was working with 3 minutes of data and 11 days of sleepless observation, and that she could not entirely justify a feeling like the moment just before you recognize a face you know. "Okay," he said, "I'm coming." They walked down to the dock. The morning was cool, the fog still low on the water. They found Art Henderson already aboard the sloop, exactly where Devorian had said he'd be, a broad-shouldered man with white hair and the hands of someone who had been working with rope and wood all his life. He listened to Marin's request without expression. When she finished, he looked out at the buoy for a moment. "You think they're waiting to be approached," he said. "I think they might be." He looked at the buoy a moment longer. Then he looked back at her. "You got any experience on a boat?" "Some. Get aboard then." The sloop moved well in the light morning air. Henderson ran it with the ease of someone who had done this so many times that the boat had become an extension of his own body. adjusting the tiller with tiny pressures, his eyes moving between the sail and the water and the horizon with a rhythm as natural as breathing. Marin sat in the cockpit and watched the buoy grow larger and tried to keep her breathing steady. At 200 meters, nothing happened. At 150, she heard Devorian make a small sound. She looked up. The chandelier had moved, not its shadow, the vessel itself, visible now through a gap in the cloud layer, a vast structure of clustered forms, was shifting. Slowly and enormously, and with the kind of deliberateness that made her stomach drop, and also, somehow made her want to laugh, the sudden absurd expansion of scope when a thing you'd been thinking about in abstract suddenly became real. At 100 meters from the buoy, the chandelier completed its rotation. It was pointed directly at them, at the sloop. At this 60-foot wooden vessel and its 81-year-old captain and its 2 passengers, Henderson had not changed his bearing. His hand on the tiller had not tightened. Marin looked at him. "You see that?" "I see it," he said. "Are you frightened?" He considered the question seriously. "Yes," he said, "but I'm not stopping." He paused. "Been coming out in this boat every morning for 53 years. Wasn't stopping, emergency office, wasn't stopping when the buoy appeared. Not stopping now." She turned back to the buoy. They were at 80 meters, 60. At 50 meters, the buoy changed. It changed slowly, and her mind took several seconds to process what she was seeing. The dark surface, which she had assumed was solid, featureless, a sealed instrument package, was opening. Not dramatically, not violently. It was opening the way a flower opens when filmed on time-lapse and played at normal speed. A barely perceptible motion that was somehow also vast and complete and irreversible. Panels she hadn't known existed folded back. Inside them was something she had no language for. Not light, exactly. Not a display. Something that operated on a frequency adjacent to visible, that she perceived as a kind of pressure behind her eyes, a warmth, a sense of dimensional depth that the buoy's small exterior should not have been able to contain. Inside that depth, structure, patterns, a moving, layered complexity that resolved as she stared at it into something that might have been data, or might have been a portrait, or might have been both. She understood then, in the way you understand something that bypasses language and arrives already whole, what the 17-second transmission had actually been. Not "we are assessing you. We see you. We have been watching you for a long time. We have watched the boats. We have watched the tides and the keepers of the tides, the people who came back to the same water every morning. We have watched the specific human practice of returning to the harbor, to the mooring, to the sloop that your father bought and that you will give to someone else before you die. We have been watching all of you return, over and over, to the small specific things you love. We wanted to know if you would notice us watching. You have. What would you like to say?" Marin sat in the cockpit of the sloop with the salt air on her face and looked into the buoy's opened interior and felt the full weight of the moment pressing down. The chandelier overhead, the fleet above that, the entire question of humanity's place in a universe now proven to contain other minds, all of it hanging in this still, foggy morning above a New England harbor. She looked at the old man at the tiller. Art Henderson was looking not at the buoy but at the water, at the harbor he had been coming to for 53 years. His expression was the expression of someone who has seen a great many things change and has kept coming back anyway. He had known the harbor when it was full of working boats. He had watched the working boats become pleasure boats, and the pleasure boats become fewer, and the water become cleaner and then less clean. He had watched hurricanes reshape the shoreline. He had watched his friends stop coming to their own boats. He had kept coming. He was the answer, she realized. He was what she needed to say. She didn't know the language. She didn't know if language was even the right category for what the Verath used. But she thought about the 17-second transmission arriving on a frequency humans hadn't been designed to receive, arriving 6 hours into the Verath's observation of human panic, after 6 hours of watching humans react to a change they hadn't expected. They had waited until humans had time to come back to themselves, to return to the harbor. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the 3 pages of notes she had written and burned. She realized now, rewritten them in her head every day since. She did not need the paper. She turned to face the opened buoy, the thing inside it that was watching, and she said, not in words but in the specific gesture of this moment, in the shape of being here, this is what we do. We come back, we don't know why, not entirely, but we come back to the same water, to the same worn wood, to the same early light that is never exactly the same. We do this even when we are afraid. We do this especially when we are afraid. That is not stubbornness, not exactly. It is the closest thing we have to saying we intend to stay. The buoy's interior shifted. The patterns moved. Above them the chandelier shifted again. Not away, toward. Marin let out a breath she'd been holding for 11 days. Art, she said, do you have anything on board to eat? I think this is going to take a while. He looked at her sideways. I have coffee, he said. It's not great. That's fine. He leaned down and produced a battered thermos from the seat locker. He handed it to her without ceremony, the way you hand something to a person you have decided to trust. She poured and passed it to Devorian, who took it with both hands like it was something important. And it was exactly that. Something ordinary made important by what surrounded it, the human scale of a thermos of mediocre coffee in a morning that had just become the largest morning in the history of the species. They sat in the sloop on the quiet water and waited, and the Vareth waited with them, and the harbor did what harbors do. It rose and fell, the same as it had always risen and fallen, indifferent to the enormity of the moment and containing it perfectly. Marin looked at the buoy. She looked at the light on the water. It was the same light as it had been every morning for 11 days. She had not noticed until just now that it was beautiful.